Welcome. This is the lecture to replace Friday's Bible survey class. So we're going to try to cover quite a bit of ground here in about 45 to 50 minutes. We'll see how far we get. We're going to start with looking at a couple more parables of Jesus, one more from the Gospel of Luke, one from the Gospel of Matthew. Want to make a few comments about the Gospel of John. We've already made some in class, but want to continue kind of drawing distinctions from how John is different than the Synoptic Gospels. And I'll give you a few examples. And then we'll begin talking about what is called the Passion Week, or the last week of Jesus' life leading up to his death on the cross. So to begin, the first parable we're going to look at is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is found in Luke chapter 10. It's a fairly familiar story for many of us. It's also just a concept that has kind of entered popular culture. So even often if folks are not familiar with the story itself or with much of the Gospels, they've heard that term like, oh, you want to be a good Samaritan, or this person was a good Samaritan. So the context for this story is a man has come to Jesus. So I'm gonna read the introduction to the story, then we'll pause, make a couple comments, and then read the parable itself. So on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus replied, what is written in the law? How do you read it? And the man answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus replied, you have answered correctly. Do this, and you will live. But the man wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Okay, so I want to pause there with that last sentence. So this man has asked, what am I supposed to do? Jesus replies, well, what do you think? The guy says, I'm supposed to love God, love my neighbor. And that goes, tremendous answer. Do that and you will please God. But the man wanted to justify himself. So he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? So I want to make a comment about what I think is going on here, what scholars think is going on here. The man isn't, he's not looking for a definition of the term neighbor. I mean, what he is asking here is how far does that go? Like, I get it that I'm supposed to love others, but how, like, if you're drawing a circle around yourself, right? Like, how far out does that circle have to go? Like, okay, I get it. I need to care for myself and my family, right? Okay, a little bit further to my next door neighbors or the people in my synagogue or immediate community. They're my neighbors, sure, I get that, but when do I get to stop? Like how far out does this circle of concern go, right? Like just how far are you expecting me to care for people, Jesus? When do I get to say, no, you're no longer us. You're no longer neighbor. You are now them, the enemy, the other, the person that I'm not obligated morally to care for, right? So this is a pretty loaded question, and a question that cultures try to figure out all the time. Right now, all around the world, in Europe and North America, as we're experiencing refugee crises from various conflicts and natural disasters, people trying to flee violence and come into countries. Are they my neighbor? Like, are we obligated as a community, as a nation, to care for them? At what point do we get to say, you aren't people that God asked me to be concerned about? I need to take care of those close to me first. And so that's kind of this question that the man asked. And so Jesus tells this story. In reply, Jesus said, a man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho, when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. And so too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came to where the man was. And when the Samaritan saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him, bandaged his wounds, pouring out oil and wine. And then it goes on to give more detail of this incredible level of concern that this Samaritan takes for this man who's been left for dead on the side of the road, including quite a bit of commitment of time that he gives, as well as financially. Like he pays an innkeeper to let the man rest and recuperate there, and says, I'm going to come back in several days, and when I come back, if the bill is higher than what I've given you, I will pay you more. But I just want this man to be cared for. And at the end of the story, well, we'll comment on the end of the story in a moment as we get to it. So want to back up. So this is a pretty familiar story, and on the surface, quite simple. I mean, there's not a ton of moving pieces or complex plot points. But the two men who passed by on the other side, a priest and a Levite, both men who would work at the temple. So they are sort of the religious elite of Israel, right? They're people who are very not only committed to following God, but uber committed. I mean, their entire life is working in the temple. Their entire life is serving God. They're also then particularly concerned about the clean and unclean issues that we've talked about in class quite a bit, right? So every Jew in the first century is concerned about clean and unclean, and how do I avoid clean and keep myself pure. But for somebody that works in the temple, that's ultra important. Like, he cannot perform the tasks that are required of him. He cannot do his job if he is unclean. So these two men are on their way to Jerusalem, probably to the temple, probably to do their work. And they see this man laying by the side of the road, right? And the text says that when they see him, each of them in turn passes by on the other side. Now, there's probably at least a couple reasons why they do that, right? One is this clean and unclean issue, right? So if I touch this man who is bleeding in the dirt, I'm going to be ceremonially unclean. Like, I'm going to not be able to perform my tasks, my job when I get to Jerusalem. Like, it requires me to be pure, and this is going to make me impure. This man's bleeding, this man's, the dirt, the blood, everything that's kind of mixed together here in this scene. So part of the passing by on the other side is, like we've talked about, this uber concern, ultra concern with keeping away from anything that can make me impure, that hedge around the Torah idea. So that's part of what's going on. But I think also a part of that is something that probably is much more common to me and you, that any of us have probably experienced. I know that I've been in major cities, even Portland, but New York City or Boston or Chicago or, some large metropolitan area. I'm walking downtown or I'm riding on a subway, and you see a homeless person, right? Or, somebody sleeping on the sidewalk, or somebody kind of, panhandling on the corner, or sitting on the train, and clearly filthy, clearly homeless, clearly, perhaps having mental health issues. And I think all of us have a tendency, as we see somebody like that, as we're walking down the sidewalk, to look away, right? Like to avert our eyes. Because what is it that happens if I look at the person, right? And particularly if I look at the person and they look at me. Like, if somehow we make eye contact, the whole situation changes, right? I mean, you've probably felt that awkwardness when that happens, because now that we have seen one another, now I'm implicated. Like, now I'm obligated to respond in some way. And if I pass on by, it's clear to the person sitting there, like, you saw me. You saw my need. You saw the situation I'm in, and you chose to ignore it. But if I look away, if all of a sudden I'm really interested in a conversation with my neighbor that's on the other side of the sidewalk, or perhaps I get my phone out and gosh, I'm really fascinated all of a sudden with something going on the screen of my phone. Oh, homeless person? I don't know what you're talking about. I was just reading a text message. I didn't see that person, right? So there's this sense of, if I don't come into proximity, if I pass by on the other side, if I don't see them, they're not really there. And I think part of what's happening with these men is that issue as well. Like, the closer they get to him, the more likely they're going to be drawn in. And then a Samaritan comes and does the exact opposite. Now, we've talked a little bit in class about the Samaritans being kind of a half-breed sort of Jew. That they are part of the northern kingdom was destroyed by Assyria. They've been blended with other cultures. So the Jews in the south, where Jesus and the crowd that he's talking to are from, really look down on people from Samaria. Like, they're the next worst thing to being a Gentile. I mean, they are not pure Jews. They don't follow Yahweh properly. They don't worship right, and mostly their blood is mixed with pagans, with Gentiles. And so this is an enemy, right? This would be like telling the story in America today and saying, and then a member of ISIS walks by, or some telling a story during World War II, and then a Nazi walks by, and the Nazi or the ISIS member or the Samaritan in this case doesn't act like they're expected to act. This is an enemy. So this is a Samaritan. The Samaritan knows full well that the person who sees him, the person laying in the road, if the situation were reversed, might well walk right by, might even spit on him, kind of thing, like look at him in disdain. And yet the text says that the Samaritan sees him, that eye contact we're talking about, and goes to him, right? Doesn't crosses the road to be next to him, rather than, oh, I'm on the other side, I don't really notice that, maybe somebody on that side of the road will take care of it. No, he goes to him, and then provides these profound acts of care. And then at the end of the story, Jesus says to the man who had asked the original question, now which of these three do you think is a neighbor? Right? And we kind of know where this story is going. Like, well, he's going to have to say the Samaritan. But like, that's the furthest person out, right? Geographically, a Samaritan lives further away than the other two men in the story. Physically, he's not as close a neighbor. Culturally, he's 1,000 miles away, right? He's a hated Samaritan. And yet he is the one who's the neighbor, because he is the one who has acted in kindness towards this man who's in distress. So I think, Jesus answers, how does he answer that question? Who is my neighbor? And I think what's clear is he has come back to, in some ways, kind of the same idea back in Jonah. Remember, like, Jonah, why are you angry that I am having compassion on these people? These Gentiles, these Ninevites that you hate. Aren't they part of my family too? Aren't they people that I created and therefore care for? And I think what Jesus is saying is, okay, in answer to the question, how big does the circle of neighborness, how big does that get? And Jesus' answer is, as far as it goes, right? As far as you can find somebody who is in need, they are a person who you are obligated to. Your neighbor is anyone and everyone. Your neighbor is the person in front of you who needs you, be they enemy, stranger, of your race, of your religion, of your ethnicity, or not, right? They are the neighbor. Okay, so that's our first parable. The second one we're going to look at, and we're going to try to move a little more quickly here, is a parable from Matthew. We've looked at a couple in Luke, so I want to show you Matthew also features a lot of these parables of Jesus. So I'm going to summarize this one just for the sake of time. So this is the parable of the workers in the vineyard. It's taken from Matthew 20. So the scene here is, well, this was talked about quite a bit in Santa Biblia. Gonzalez features several parts about, workers trying to find day labor. And so the scene is, there's workers gathered in the morning, and a vineyard owner comes and hires several of them. Come work for me all day, picking grapes in my vineyard, and at the end of the day, I'll pay you. And so he picks up some at 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, kind of at dawn, and they go to the fields and they begin to work all day long. But he needs more, and he goes back a couple times during the day, and each time finds more people that have not been hired, at noon, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 9 o'clock in the morning, whatnot. So each time he gathers up these workers, they go to work in the vineyard. And at the end of the day, there's a handful of workers that only work a couple hours. They come at 3, they're done at 5. They barely do anything. They do a fraction of what the other workers do. And at the end of the day, they line up to be paid. And the people that had just come at the very end of the day are the first ones to be paid. And to their surprise and the surprise of everyone in line, the owner of the field pays them a full day's wages. And so the folks at the back of the line are very excited, like, well, this is great. I worked 4 times longer than those guys. I'm probably going to get 4 times the pay. This is going to be wonderful. But as each group comes forward, they also get a day's wages. And then the people at the beginning of the line that worked all day grumble. I mean, they're really upset. Like, why? It's not fair, right? It's not fair that they get as much as I get. I work twice as hard as them, 4 times as hard. Like, I was here all day slaving in the sun. They were here for just a few minutes, of a couple hours, and they got just as much as me. How is that fair? And then the master of the vineyard says this to them. Um, I am not being unfair to you, friends. Didn't I agree to pay you a day's wages? Take your pay and go. If I want to give the one who was hired last the same as I gave you, that is my business. Don't I have the right to do what I want with my own money? Or are you envious because I am generous? And again, I think we see some echoes of Jonah here, right? Jonah, is it wrong that I should be merciful to Nineveh? And here we have Jesus kind of putting the same sort of sentiment in the mouth of the owner of this field. Don't I have the right to be generous with my money? Why are you envious that I am generous? Right? And so here's just a personal, like Gonzalez talked about his sort of cultural interaction with that parable. I want to give you my personal perspective, and I suspect it may resonate or relate with some of your experiences. I heard this story as a kid. I remember going to Sunday school and church and hearing this, or hearing this in youth group when I was in middle school or high school. And I'll be perfectly honest, I really did not like this parable. I mean, there's other stories in the Gospels that I liked tremendously, but this was not one of them, because I kind of agreed with the workers in the field. I think, as we've talked about, I was a pretty religious kid, especially in high school. The whole taking my Bible to school every day, not going to the reservoir to drink with my friends. Like, I worked very hard to please God. And I think I kind of expected, like, because I was so serious as a Christian, somehow God was going to reward me especially. And so when I read this story as a young person, I was like, they've got a point. Like, absolutely. They have every right to be upset. They should get, God should recognize how devoted they are and reward them. How dare he give mercy to the same level of pay to these people that come at the end. And then after I graduated high school, graduated college, and began my work life, I experienced a whole different set of things. I failed a little bit. The first job I had was in ministry, and I made some pretty significant mistakes and kind of got fired from it. I had some relationships dating relationships that didn't go well, and some of that was on me. Like, real, pretty profound mistakes I made in those. And for the very first time in my life, I sort of experienced the place of being kind of at the other end of the line. Like, okay, here I am, God, and I don't really deserve much, because I've kind of screwed up. I mean, I've made some real mistakes, and here's all my life I've thought I was the one working extra hard and pleasing you, and now I'm not so sure. And my experience was that God extended mercy and forgiveness and grace to me just as much in those times of mistakes as when I was younger and so diligent and serious about my faith. And so I think one of the lessons over time that I've come to see in this parable is, what if all of us are the folks that show up at 3? Like, what if at the end of the day, really none of us put in a full day's work? None of us are so spiritual, so disciplined that we're able to please God. And that really the beautiful thing is that God is the owner of this field, that God interacts with each of us like he does with those workers at the end of the day. Don't I have a right to do what I want with my money, with my mercy, with my forgiveness? Are you envious because I am generous? Like, when I was really self-righteous and pretty sure that I was better as a Christian than everyone else, I was pretty envious when I felt like God was being merciful to people that didn't deserve it. But when I got a better sense of myself, and that maybe I wasn't so deserving, maybe I was a whole lot more like the folks at the end of the line who had just been there an hour or two, this became a much different and a much more beautiful parable to me. And my question for you would be, which end of the line are you at? Some of us may think we're at the, oh gosh, I was here at dawn and I've been working hard all day and I've really gotten it right. I've done quite a bit to please God. God's kind of lucky to have me on his team. And my question is, what if that's not so true? Like, what if really, at the end of the day, even the best of us are, yeah, I've been here an hour and I don't deserve much, but I will be super thankful and gracious for any mercy and forgiveness you have to give, God. And I think the beautiful thing is that the gospel is that Jesus extends that. God extends mercy beyond what we could ever dream of. So that's a second parable. There's many more throughout the Synoptic Gospels. Some of the most beloved parts of Scripture for Christians all over the world are these stories. So if you're unfamiliar with them, I encourage you to read them more and to kind of let them speak to you. As we said in class, part of the beauty of the parables is they're a familiar story, and then there's often a twist, and the story kind of turns around on itself and ends up kind of asking you a question. Okay, I know you think you know who you are in the story, but is that really true? Or are you a different character than maybe you thought? Maybe you're the one in need of forgiveness, the one in need of mercy. That certainly has been my experience with that parable. Okay, so moving on to some comments about John. We're not going to make a ton, which is a tragedy. John is a beautiful gospel and deserves a whole lot more attention, as almost every book we've looked at, than the time we're able to give it here. So we've already commented about how in John, Jesus speaks differently in a couple ways, right? So I want to give some specific examples of those. One is there are these collection of 7 what are called I am statements. I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the good shepherd. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the resurrection. So they're sprinkled throughout John. Jesus says them at various points, but they're so opposite from that messianic secret in the synoptics, right? Whereas in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus is often being secretive about who he is, and John, far from it. Like, he's boldly announcing, who am I? I am this great thing that you need. And in addition to that, he also talks often about his equality with God. You want to see God? Look at me. You want to see what God wants? Look at what I'm doing. I do what the Father asks, and I come from the Father, and I will. So in John, you have Jesus very publicly and boldly talking about his divinity, talking about how he is on the same level as God. Now, there's a term for this, and I've made a really crappy card to show you. This down in your notes. So the term here is Christology, right? So Christology is the view of Jesus or the study of Jesus that a particular gospel has. So sometimes scholars will talk about high Christology and low Christology. So high Christology is a view that emphasizes Jesus's divinity. So Christians, as we've mentioned, kind of have this belief that Jesus is 100% God and somehow mysteriously also 100% human. That he's not like 90% God and a little bit human, but let's be honest, he's really God, just pretending to be like you and I. Nor is he, well, he's just really a super great human. Picture Gandhi and Mother Teresa and, the nicest person you've ever met, roll them into one and add a little bit more on, and that's Jesus. And so he's God-like, but he's really a human, right? That's not what Christians believe. Christians believe that some way, fully God, fully human, both of them together. But at different points in the Bible, you will have books that have what is called a high Christology and a low Christology. So a high Christology is the Gospel of John. In John, you have these statements of like human God, mostly an emphasis upon Jesus' divinity, on the ways in which he is equal to or like God. In the Synoptics, you have kind of the opposite. Now, none of the Gospels deny high or low. Like no Gospel, none of the 4 deny that Jesus is equal to God. None of the Gospels deny that he's human, but they emphasize different elements of who Jesus is. Right? So Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you get a very clear picture of his humanity. You see how he feels about things when he's moved to compassion. At one point, he weeps at the death of a friend. Um, he gets angry and frustrated at various points. So in the synoptics, you have what is called a low Christology, or a real stress or focus upon his humanity. In John, you have the opposite. You have what's called a high Christology. A lot of comments about, Jesus talking about how he relates to God as an equal, not in the way that you or I do, but as one that is on the same level as God. So part of how Christianity developed this idea of Jesus as fully God and fully human is the differences between the four Gospels. I think I mentioned that in class earlier, but without all of that, it would be hard to come up with it. We would probably land on one of those other mistaken positions, that he was really a God pretending to be human, or he was just a really wonderful human who was God-like in how awesome he was. But because of the Gospels and this high and low Christology in both, we have a sense that he's both simultaneously, like he's fully God, fully human. So that's one of the key points that comes out in John. A couple other things. So Jesus talks more boldly about himself. Another way he talks differently, I've alluded to this already. In John, he doesn't give parables. I mean, there are a few metaphors that he uses, but he doesn't speak in these stories like he does in the Synoptics. Instead, he gives speeches. So I want to read just a little bit of one of these. They're often kind of confusing or very involved or elaborate speeches that he's giving at this point. So here's from John 15. And some of this you may recognize. A few of these passages are fairly famous. So it says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. The gardener cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes. If you remain in me, and I remain in you, no branch can bear fruit by itself, but if it must remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. And this is to my Father's glory, because I am in the Father, and the Father is in me. So if you remain in me, you also will be in the Father. So it's kind of like these intricate, involved, like, how do you map that out, right? Okay, Jesus is in God, Jesus is in the Father is in Jesus. If we're in Jesus, then we're in the Father. I mean, it gets kind of messy, right? Whereas in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, well, you want to know what's God like? Let me tell you a story. Like it's this sort of folksy, down home, sitting out on the back porch, just telling stories, telling tales. Whereas in John, it's more like, okay, here's a big philosophical lecture that you're going to need to write every detail down because it's going to be very involved and elaborate. Now, we don't know why Jesus speaks that way in John. Is it, as we've suggested in class, one possibility is Jesus talked both of those ways. And John just happens to prefer the lecture, philosophical kind of speech that Jesus uses, and that's what he writes down. Whereas the prefer the folksy storytelling Jesus, so that's what they write down. Some suggest that what you have in John or the Synoptics, but probably more in John, is this is how John thinks. So John is taking ideas that Jesus has and putting them into language that he might use. Or another option is the specific audience that John is writing to. Like, is John writing to more of an educated Greek, philosophically oriented audience? Like, you probably have professors here, me to a limited degree, but some that would certainly be more so. Like, if I'm talking to a group of freshmen in a course, I would likely speak one way. If I were giving a speech to my peers, or to, like a convention of PhD theology and Bible scholars, I might use different vocabulary, right? With freshmen in this class, like, well, let's break that down into a story. In a lecture to, PhDs somewhere in some lecture hall at Stanford or something, I might use, okay, what are all the big complicated SAT words I could pull out to really impress or, bring this point home in that kind of way. And there's some senses in which maybe the audience of John is partly dictating the way John has Jesus talk. That maybe the audience of the synoptics is a much less educated, more simple kind of reader, and the audience of John is perhaps more complex. Now, all of that is conjecture. We really don't know, but it is pretty clear. Like if you read the Gospels next to each other, both this difference in terms of shyness in the Gospels and the Synoptics, Jesus is so reticent, so secretive about who he is, his identity as Messiah and equal to God. Whereas in John, it's very clear that Jesus is not hesitant in one little bit about any of that stuff. But also this teaching style, right? So on the final, I'm probably going to ask you about both. How does Jesus talk about himself? In John, he's much more outgoing, much more boastful, much more clear in claiming equality with God. What is his style? Well, it's much less storytelling, much less parable, much more kind of involved Greek sounding philosophical discourse. Okay, so those are some differences. Again, John is a beautiful gospel, deserving of infinitely more attention than we're able to give it, the last week or two, and certainly here in this little video. Okay, so now moving to the last segment of the time here. We've got about 17, 18 minutes, and want to move to an event that all four Gospels talk about, right? So there's only a handful of things that is in every Gospel. A few miracles of Jesus's, a few events in Jesus's life, but the thing that all four Gospels share is an event that is called the Passion. So the Passion is another term for just kind of the death of Jesus. So Passion Week is the week leading up to Jesus's death. Now, every gospel devotes more time to this than any single event in Jesus's life. If I can properly lift up my card so you can see it. So each gospel devotes at least, at a very minimum, 20% of its words, pages, and at a maximum 33%. In the Gospel of Mark, 1/3 of the entire gospel is 5 days out of Jesus's life, right? So no birth story, very little teaching. Mark mostly wants to tell you about how Jesus died and the events immediately preceding that, and then what happened after, which is going to be the resurrection. So 1/3 of the Gospel of Mark is just this week. So we've talked about how in Mark, Jesus is in a hurry. He's always, immediately, he went from here, and right away he went to this next place, and the very next day, like Mark is just sprint till this week, and then boom, he just comes to a screeching halt and slows down. And now you get this very slow, methodical walk through each of the days of the last week of Jesus's life. And that's true in all four Gospels. So now we also ought to note, though, they don't tell exactly the same sequence of events, right? So, obviously Jesus does several things in this last week, and the gospel writers pick and choose, as we've talked about. They're editors, right? So that they're kind of picking and choosing what they're going to include. So there's many places where they overlap, but there's a handful of places where they don't. So just for this evening, we're going to look at just a few of kind of the events that happen during this, what is called Passion Week. And the Passion is the death of Jesus. Passion Week is the events leading up to it. Now, it happens to coincide with Passover Week in Judaism, right? Which is, we've talked about back at the beginning of the semester, the holiday in Judaism that commemorates what? God's rescue of the Israelites from Egypt. And that's really going to be significant, because what triggers that is God saying to Moses, I have heard my people crying out in their suffering. I have come down to rescue them, right? We're going to see at Jesus' Last Supper that he does not miss the significance of the fact that his death on the cross is going to happen in the middle of Passover week, or kind of it's the culmination of it. That just as God came down, heard the suffering of the Israelites, came down and rescued them from Egypt, again, God has heard humanity's suffering, and Jesus has come down. God has come down in Jesus to rescue, right? So it's a very significant and important fact that the Passion Week is Passover week. That the two, like that's a symbolism and metaphor that really you kind of have to understand for this to make sense. So the first event of Passion Week, if you grew up going to church, this would be Palm Sunday, right? So um, as we've talked about, if you're a Jew anywhere in the world, and within weeks of walking distance, every Jew that can is expected to come to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. So, during most of the year, Jerusalem at this point is a pretty small town. Probably looks, it's bigger than Newburgh. It probably looks closer to Newburgh than Portland or Seattle or LA or something like that. But during Passover week, it would swell immensely, like 5, 10 times as many people crammed into the city. So masses of Jews coming together to celebrate Passover. Now, we've already talked about how this expectation, right, this frustration and expectation that is developed over hundreds of years, right, as one empire, first the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, now the Romans, one empire after another has ruled over Israel, has ruled over Jerusalem. Like we got to come home from the exile, but we've never been free. We've always suffered under one empire after another. And when is God going to rescue us? Right? So that's there all the time. If you're a first century Jew, all the time, you're waiting on what is called the consolation of Israel, like for God to come rescue Israel. But at no point in the year is that more intense than during Passover for a couple reasons. And I think these are probably fairly obvious, to you as you're listening. Like the first reason is, what are they celebrating? A time when God did exactly that, right? The whole point of Passover is let's all get together and talk about how God rescued us from our oppressors, right? And so it's then would just be natural to sit and think, why hasn't he done this yet for us? He did it for them. He did it for our ancestors back in Egypt. When will God rescue us from Rome? Right? So the situation, the Passover itself kind of creates some, energy around this idea of deliverance, that the Messiah is going to come and politically, militarily deliver us. But also just the crowds. You've got this tiny, sleepy kind of Jerusalem is now this massive, packed, everywhere you go in the streets, it's people talking about Passover. Every room in every hotel, every spare, floor space is filled up with some relative who's camping out there to celebrate Passover. So you've just got this massive cluster of folks talking about deliverance, talking about rescue. Okay, and so into that scene, Jesus arrives in Jerusalem. And the text, each of the various gospels describes this slightly differently, but what they all agree upon is that he comes into Jerusalem riding on a donkey, which he had kind of asked his followers, his disciples, to procure this donkey so he could ride into the city, which seems significant. It seems kind of a parody or a satire on Jesus's part of a king, who comes riding in on a horse. Why do we want a king? Israel asked, way back in 1 Samuel. Like, we want a king to ride out before us on a horse and look glorious. Well, here comes Jesus riding into the city, only not on a horse, but on a donkey. But still, the crowds meet him, right? So as he arrives in the city, he's done several miracles. They're excited. They think this is the Messiah. He's arriving in Jerusalem right at the beginning of Passover. Maybe this is it. Like, if this guy can raise people from the dead, if he can calm storms on the ocean, if he can do all these amazing things, he could do it. Like, he could be the one to deliver us from Rome, to kick the Romans out, to sit on the throne of David, to make it all better. And what better time than now, right? So he arrives in the city and he's greeted by these singing crowds. And they lay blankets. So it's a dusty road, right? And with all these people, with the donkey, there's dust everywhere. They don't want the king to be covered in dirt, right? So they're laying down their cloaks. They're taking off jackets and robes and laying them down on the road. But they're also taking palm branches and waving them in celebration and then laying those on the road. So it's kind of like a red carpet treatment, right? So as Jesus arrives in the city, he's not arriving in a cloud of dust. He's just coming into town with this beautiful welcome, and they're singing, Hosanna, Hosanna. Here comes God's deliverance. Here is the Messiah. And in various versions of this, in Luke and elsewhere, we have this description of Jesus kind of being sad as he witnesses this. Like, oh, Jerusalem, if only you knew. If only you knew who I was and how I have longed to rescue you. But now it's too late. Like, now the hour of your deliverance is past. And there's kind of this prophetic thing about this event that's going to happen about 4 decades later, which is the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome. And Jesus, like, I know what you want. I know you want me to be your military Messiah, and I'm not going to be that. But it's kind of this ironic, like, on the one hand, they sort of get it. They partially recognize who he is, but they also completely miss it. Like, they don't understand that he's not going to be this military Messiah. So that's kind of the first day, the first event. On the second day, you have in the various Gospels what is called the cleansing of the temple. And this is kind of a confusing story, partly because Jesus displays quite a bit of anger during this event. So he arrives at the temple, and he sees what are called money changers. And he gets furious with them, and he turns over their table, the money changers' tables, and chases them out. And he makes a whip. He takes some rope, and he winds it into a whip and chases them out of the temple, saying, you have made God's house, God's temple, instead of being a place of prayer, you've made it a den of thieves. Right? So people are often a little bit like, why is he so angry? And isn't this what happens all the time at Passover? So just a little bit of kind of cultural context real quickly about this event. So we've talked over and over again the last couple weeks about clean and unclean, right? No place is clean more important than at the temple, right? When you're making a sacrifice to God at any time of the year, but certainly at Passover, like it needs to be pure. The lamb that is brought to sacrifice, the dove that is brought to, it needs to be as pure as possible, right? So each family, part of coming to Jerusalem for Passover is to offer a sacrificial lamb, just like in Egypt. The blood of the lamb on the doorpost kind of paved the way for the Exodus. And so not every family, some families are poor. Some families have traveled such a great distance, it would be impractical to bring a lamb along with them. So you could buy one. Right, you could arrive at the temple without a lamb, purchase one there, and then make the sacrifice. And then you have pleased God. God is good with you. You're reconciled. So people recognize this is a chance to make money, right? Like, it's one thing to sell a lamb every other week of the year for $10, say, but during Passover week, you could crank it up to $100 because you've got thousands of people who have to buy a lamb. Like, they must make a sacrifice here, and we can charge anything we want. So the first thing is this need to purchase a lamb and the desperate nature of these sojourners, these people that have traveled to the city. But also, they're a part of the Roman Empire, right? So in the rest of their lives, they've been forced to use Roman money, unclean, impure Roman coins with the face of the emperor on them. Well, you can't use Roman money in God's temple. You can't buy a sacrifice. It has to be pure with unclean Gentile money. You need to change it, right? It's kind of like crossing the border from the United States to Canada or United States to Mexico. You go to a bank and you take your American dollars and you exchange them for pesos. You exchange them for loons, if you're going to Canada. You get Canadian money in exchange, and there's an exchange rate, right? So just like how the rest of the year, one Roman coin equals one temple coin. Now, again, like, hey, we have a captive market here. They will pay any exchange rate we ask them. And so, hey, last week it was one coin for one coin. This week, it's going to take you 10 Roman coins to get one temple coin. And so it's people making a killing, making a profit off of the religious devotion of these people that have come to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. So again, it's this other, like in the prophets, God's deep concern for the poor, God's deep concern for those who are in need. And what Jesus is angry at seems to be this exploitation of those folks. Like, how dare you? How dare you prey upon these poor people whose only fault is that they couldn't bring a lamb of their own and that they desire to be right with me. They desire to be made right with God, and you are making profit off of them, and you are taking advantage of them, and Jesus drives them out of the temple. Okay, so just the last event we're going to talk about, or we're kind of running out of time here, is we're going to make a couple comments about the Last Supper, which is a really pivotal event. Want to reference back to the beginning of the lecture, talking about how Jesus ties this to the Passover, right? So one of the things that happens at the Passover is Jesus begins what for Christians is called the Eucharist, or kind of this idea of communion, the breaking of bread and the drinking of wine, as kind of a semblance of Christ's body and blood shed at the cross, broken at the cross, right? So the first tie-in is not to the future. Jesus is going to do that. He's going to say, hey, whenever you gather in the future and take this bread, drink this wine, remember what I have done. Do this in remembrance of me. Like this bread and wine is going to now be a symbol, a spiritual ceremony of this event that's happening at the cross. But he also ties it back to Passover, right? So in a sense, Jesus uses this supper and the way he talks about the bread and the wine to kind of reach all the way back to the very beginning of Israel's story, bring it all the way up to this moment. Friends, what is happening now is the very same thing that happened at Exodus. I have come down to rescue. And this blood and this wine is a symbol of what is about to happen. So I am tying together that entire story that we've been reading and talking about all semester, but it's also pointing forward into what's going to become the Christian church and this celebration of communion, right? So it's this Passover event, reaching back, pulling it into the present, and kind of throwing forward or pointing forward to this time in the future. However, that's not the only thing happening at the Last Supper. There's a couple other events. So in the Gospel of John, interestingly, John doesn't talk about the bread and the wine at all. Really, the kind of big symbolic event in John's Gospel is Jesus washing the disciples' feet. And so this meal, like we think of going to a meal or having a restaurant eating at a restaurant or going to someone's home, is you're sitting at a table in chairs. In this case, they maybe had a little bit of an elevated table, but it was probably just a few inches off of the floor. And it's a dirt floor, right? And everybody is lounging and reclining on the floor, so their feet, their knees, their body, like everything is at food level, basically. They've been walking in dust day after day. So when you would arrive at somebody's house for a meal, is that a servant in the home would wash the feet of the guests. Kind of the lowest servant, would take this humble job of washing everyone's feet so that they could be, as clean as possible to not contaminate this meal. And here is Jesus, who, rather than saying, I am the Son of God, you, underlings, wash my feet, instead he washes their feet. Again, it's the upside down kingdom. It's another example of that upside down kingdom. In fact, he says, if I, your master, washes your feet, you should do likewise. Anyone in my kingdom who desires to be first should be last and be a servant of others. And the last shall be first, the first shall be last. So again, he's reiterating this upside down kingdom thing. We also have two people kind of setting the stage for betraying Jesus. Judas, who is one of his 12 closest followers, he is going to betray Jesus by turning him into the Jewish and Roman authorities who were looking for a way to arrest him and kill him. And Judas has made an agreement to go and betray Jesus, but also his closest friend Peter. Jesus at the end of this meal says, tonight, before the night is over, one of you is going to 3 times say that you've never met me. So remember when we talked about Luke 15, that triple repetition. One of you is going to 3 times in one evening say, I've never even met Jesus. And Peter says, who are you talking about? I would never do that. And yet we will see shortly that that's exactly what Peter does that night, that Jesus is kind of foretelling that. Okay, I'm going to go a minute or two over 50. I apologize. But just one last event, and then that'll lead us up to the arrest and trial of Jesus. So from this dinner, They go to the garden, this garden in Jerusalem called the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus wants to pray. And it's very interesting what happens here. It's now later in the evening. Most of his disciples he leaves behind. He brings three of his closest friends, Peter, James, and John, with him, and he says, "Pray with me." They proceed to fall asleep. They're not able to stay awake praying, and Jesus goes off by himself, and again, three times, triple repetition, prays to God. And what is interesting about his prayer is it's kind of the emotion and intensity of it. And what he prays is not, "Thank you, God, that I've lived this good life and now I'm ready to come home to you," but he prays about his pending death. And he says, "Lord, if it is your will, take this cup of death and suffering, away from me. But if it is not, if there is no other way, I am willing to faithfully do what you have asked. So, Lord, if it be your will, take this cup away from me." Three times. So again, the humanity of Jesus. Yes, he's the Son of God, but he's also fully human. And he's about to face what we're going to see on Monday, this horrific, painful, terrifying death, and he's frightened of it. He asks God, is there any other way? Because if there is, I don't want to do this. I would like to not die suffering on a cross, but I will. So I think you have both the humanity of Jesus, this fear, this anguish about what is about to come, and his request to God three times, is there a way out of this? But at the end of the day, but I'm still going to be obedient, right? In spite of my fear, in spite of my terror at what comes ahead, I'm yours. And I will faithfully do what I have come to do. And he leaves this prayer. He's kind of laid out his anguish. In fact, it says like he's in. It's so intense. He's like sweating blood from his forehead with the emotional intensity of it all. But at the end, but here we go. And now he moves away from this prayer. And from this point on, there seems to be no doubt, no fear. As the events begin to unfold, as we'll talk on Monday, he's not afraid of them at all. He kind of faces them with this serenity and calm that it seems to be the result of God kind of comforting him on some level, or at least him reaching resolution after this time of anguish and prayer. So we'll pick up Monday with what happened. So immediately after this prayer, he's arrested, and then begins his trial, his beating, his death on the cross, and then his resurrection. That'll bring us to the end of the Gospels. So we'll start there on Monday. Thank you for making it all the way through this little video.